They called her a seat filler. Not out loud, these men were too polished for that. But Maura Finch heard it in the way they adjusted their cufflinks when she walked by. She heard it in the pauses before they said her name, like they were consulting a list of things they'd rather not touch. She was the woman standing next to Knox Rourke at the head of the Meridian table, and nobody in that room could figure out why. Knox Rourke ran the Eastern Seaboard's most powerful crime, syndicate, the way other men ran hedge funds. Quietly, ruthlessly, and with an eye toward returns. He had built Meridian from 3 port contracts and a reputation for being the last man standing in any negotiation. He was 41, broad-shouldered, and had never once done anything that didn't serve a calculated purpose, which was exactly why none of them could explain Maura. She was 32. She had wide hips and a round face and the kind of laugh that carried across a room when she forgot to restrain it. She worked in urban planning for the city of Baltimore, which was not glamorous. She drove a 7-year-old Honda. She was not a trophy. She was not a bargaining chip. She was not a name anybody in this world had ever heard. And Knox had married her on a Thursday with 4 witnesses and a judge, and told precisely nobody why. The wedding, such as it was, had none of the theatre the syndicate expected. No reception at the Willard. No 7-course dinner, no display. Knox signed the papers, slid a plain gold band onto Maura's finger, and had her moved into his Georgetown townhouse before the ink dried. The rumors started the same afternoon. She has something on him. That was the charitable version. The less charitable version was whispered over bourbon at private clubs. He's lost it. 41 years old, and he marries a civilian nobody because of what? Sentiment? Loneliness? The crueler version. The one passed between wives and girlfriends, and the kind of women who understood how this world worked, was that Knox Rourke had finally gone soft, and that a man who chose comfort over consequence was a man who would not last. Maura heard all of it. She had good ears, always had. Growing up in a house with thin walls teaches you to listen for what people are almost saying. She unpacked her books into Knox's mahogany shelves. She left her reference texts, 3 on municipal water infrastructure, 1 fat volume on zoning law, a worn copy of The Death and Life of Great American Cities, in a stack on the end table beside the couch, and she settled in the way she settled everywhere, methodically, without apology. Knox watched her arrange things and said nothing. He had said very little since the judge's office. He brought her a cup of coffee the first morning, without asking how she took it, and it was black, and she drank it without comment, and they understood each other a little better after that. "They're going to test you," Knox said on the 4th night, not looking up from the documents spread across the dining room table. Maura turned a page. "I assumed, not me, you." She looked up then. In the low light of the lamp, Knox Rourke looked less like a crime lord and more like a man who hadn't slept well in years. There were things behind his eyes she hadn't catalogued yet. "Let them," she said, and went back to her book. The first test came from Renata Vidal. Renata was the wife of Felix Vidal, who controlled the syndicate's West Baltimore operations and had made it known, subtly and persistently, that he felt he should have had more input into the direction Meridian was taking. Felix was too careful to say anything himself, but Renata had no such restraints, and she cornered Maura at the first dinner Knox brought her to, a gathering at the Vidals' house in Roland Park, all marble countertops and fresh flowers, and the kind of wealth that had learned to look casual. "You look so comfortable," Renata said, her eyes doing a slow lap of Maura's dress. Navy, well-fitted, not expensive enough for this room. Knox always did prefer his furniture overstuffed. The table went just slightly quieter. Maura set down her wineglass. She looked at Renata for a long moment, the kind of look that takes measurements, and then she smiled. "You know what I've always thought about furniture," Maura said pleasantly. "The pieces that last are the ones built to hold weight. The decorative ones fall apart the first time someone actually sits down." She picked up her glass again. Renata didn't speak to her for the rest of the evening. Felix watched Maura from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. Knox, who had been in conversation 12 feet away, and had somehow heard the whole exchange, refilled her wine without a word, and let his hand rest briefly at the small of her back. The first time he had voluntarily touched her since the ring. It was nothing, she told herself. A performance for the room. She was good at telling herself things. The next 3 months established a rhythm. Knox moved through his world with the precision of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, and Maura moved beside him, into meetings she wasn't meant to understand, into dinners where she was meant to be decorative, into the uncomfortable space between being a wife and being a stranger. She was not decorative. She kept her mouth shut strategically and her ears open constantly, and she built a map of Meridian's internal politics the same way she'd built her thesis on Baltimore's sewer system, carefully, exhaustively, with attention to where the pressure was accumulating. There was pressure in the Vidal corner. She could feel it like a change in weather. Knox felt it too. She could tell by the way he reviewed documents twice, by the late nights, by the way he'd taken to sitting with his back to walls in restaurants. But he said nothing. He was a man who processed threat the way other people processed grief, privately, thoroughly, and without asking for company. One night, late October, she found him still at his desk at 2 a.m. Felix made a call to someone in the Tremblay organization, she said from the doorway. She'd heard it mentioned, a fragment, at the Vidal dinner 2 weeks prior. She'd been sitting with the piece of it since. Knox looked up slowly. "How do you know that name?" "I listen," she said. "You should know that by now." He studied her for a long moment. Outside, rain hammered the windows. It was always raining in October in this city. Finally, he said, "Tremblay controls 4 ports in the northeast. If Felix is talking to them, he's not asking for a favor. He's building a case," Maura said, "or a coalition." Knox was quiet. "You understand what that means. I grew up in a row house in Dundalk," Maura said. "My uncle ran numbers for 15 years before somebody decided he was a liability. I understand what it means." She went to bed. Knox stayed at his desk. But the next morning there was a second cup of coffee on the counter, and it was exactly the right color, and she understood that something had shifted between them, though neither of them would have been able to name it yet. The coalition, and that's what it was. 4 men who had decided that Knox's era was ending and that they would benefit from accelerating the timeline, moved in the 3rd week of November. Knox had arranged a weekend at a property outside Annapolis. It was partly logistics. There were documents to sign with a partner who preferred not to come into the city, and partly, Maura suspected, an attempt to get them both out of the townhouse and into a space where they could be people instead of roles. He had been different lately, less careful with the distance he kept. He'd asked her, twice, about her work. He'd actually listened to the answers. The property was a converted farmhouse, set back from the water, surrounded by bare trees and an early winter silence. Maura brought her books. Knox brought his documents. They ate dinner across from each other in the kitchen like they might be any 2 people. And it was easy in a way that surprised her, and she noticed him noticing that, and she looked away first. She woke at 3 a.m. to a sound that wasn't the house. Maura Finch had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned the difference between sounds that were accidents and sounds that were deliberate. The sound downstairs was deliberate. Careful footsteps, multiple sets, not in a hurry because they believed the house was asleep. She sat up. Knox was not in the bed. He had been called to a separate room for a late call. She'd heard him leave around midnight. That room was on the far end of the farmhouse, past the kitchen, past whoever was currently moving through it. She did not panic. Panic was for people who hadn't already thought through the bad outcomes. She had thought through the bad outcomes. It was, professionally and personally, her primary skill. She slid out of bed. The floorboards in this house she had mapped over 2 days out of habit. 3rd one from the door. Don't step on it. She moved to the closet, reached past her coat, and retrieved the case Knox had shown her the first week, matter-of-factly, the way you show someone where the fire extinguisher is. In case he had said, she had not said, "I already know how to use one." She had not said. My father taught me to shoot in a quarry outside the city when I was 14, and I went back every year until I was better than him." She had not said any of that because Knox hadn't asked, and she had learned long ago that the things people don't think to ask about are often the most useful ones to have. There were 3 of them. She determined this by the weight of movement, the distribution of sound through the house's bones. 2 in the main area, 1 who had gone wide. Around back, she thought. She was in her socks. She almost smiled. They interrupted my reading, she thought. She'd been 2 chapters from the end of something excellent. The man who came around the back of the staircase found someone waiting for him, and what happened next was neither quiet nor pleasant. And then there were 2. The second one she heard coming before he rounded the corner, and the element of surprise she had discovered was not actually about speed. It was about the other person's assumptions. He assumed he was hunting. He had failed to account for the possibility that the prey had already changed positions. The third one was smarter. He didn't come through the main room. He waited, which told her something about his training, and she waited too, in the dark at the top of the stairs, and the house was very quiet, and she could hear her own heartbeat, and she found it steady, which was one of the few things she genuinely liked about herself. He came up the left side. She had expected the right. She adjusted. And then it was quiet in a different way. The way a house is quiet when the thing it was waiting for has finished. She found Knox 3 minutes later. He was at the door to the back room with a phone in one hand, and when he saw her, in her socks, with 3 men neutralized between them and the front door, holding the case with a composure that suggested she was debating whether to finish her book, he stopped. He looked at her for a long time. "The call was a distraction," she said. "Get you away from the main room, away from me." She set the case down on the hall table. It was Felix, or someone moving on Felix's behalf. Knox's voice, when it came, was carefully controlled. "Are you hurt?" "How?" He stopped. Started again. "You never said, you never asked." She went to the kitchen and made coffee because it was almost 4 in the morning and she suspected neither of them was going back to sleep, and Knox sat down at the table in a way she had never seen him sit before. Not like a man who controls things, but like a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of other things. "My father," she said, handing him a cup, "used to say that a barn cat and a show cat look exactly the same to someone who's never needed either one." Knox wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at its edges. The trees stood very still. "He was right," Knox said. "The next 72 hours moved fast in the way that consequences always do once they arrive." Knox made calls. His men arrived. Felix Vidal discovered, with a thoroughness that brooked no ambiguity, that his coalition had failed to survive its opening move, and that Knox Rourke was not, as it turned out, soft. The Tremblay contact was severed. Felix himself was handled in the manner that internal betrayals are handled in organizations that cannot afford public trials. Renata Vidal left for her sister's house in Tampa and did not return. Knox stood at the head of the Meridian table 3 days later, the same table, the same men, the same room that had watched him walk in with Maura 4 months ago, and collectively decided she was a punchline. She stood beside him, same posture, same composure. The room was different, though. The room knew something now that it hadn't known before. Knox said, "I want to make something clear." He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Decisions about Meridian's future are made by 2 people in this organization. You have always known who I am. It is time you understood who she is." Nobody adjusted their cufflinks. Nobody paused before saying her name. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Knox stopped walking. "I owe you an apology," he said. Maura looked at him. "For what? For thinking of this as—" He stopped. Started again, which she had learned was rare for him. "I married you because your uncle vouched for your discretion, and I needed a domestic arrangement that wouldn't invite complications. I told myself it was practical. It was practical. It was also," Knox said carefully, "incomplete as an assessment." The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon. "I know," she said. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that first morning with the coffee, like he was adding something up, and the answer was larger than he'd expected. "The barn cat," he said. "The barn cat," she confirmed. She had never needed anyone to rescue her. She had, once or twice in her life, needed someone to see her clearly. Not the seat filler, not the punchline, not the decorative choice that made a powerful man look either foolish or sentimental. Just Maura, the woman who memorized floor plans and finished books and made coffee in a crisis, and had never once, in 32 years, been as breakable as anyone assumed. Knox Rourke, who had built his world on the ability to read people, to know exactly what he was dealing with before anyone else did, had taken 4 months to figure out what she was. She was willing to let him make up for lost time. Outside the tall windows, Baltimore gleamed in the grey November afternoon, all its infrastructure and water mains and weight-bearing walls holding up exactly as she had always known they would, if you just bothered to understand how they were built.